So in the treatise, Hume claims that his account of causal necessity involves a violent paradox. Indeed, he claims it's the most violent of the work. There's pretty stiff competition for this honor, if it's really an honor, and it might be surprising to find Hume claiming that the most violent paradox of the work is to be found in his treatment of causal necessity, and not, say, in his account of personal identity, or of the belief in body, or in any of the skeptical arguments of Treatise Book 1, Part 4. So my aim today is to offer an account of just what this paradox is. Hume claims that the paradox arises from the discovery that, quote, the efficacy or energy of causes is neither placed in the causes themselves, nor in the deity, nor in the concurrence of these two principles, but belongs entirely to the soul, which considers the union of two or more objects in all past instances. So this looks like the claim that facts about causal necessity are dependent in some way on facts about the mind. Indeed, I shall argue that Hume does hold that causal necessity is mind-dependent and that this is the violent paradox. Moreover, Hume holds that necessary connections are mind-dependent in a particularly radical way. He seems to hold that two events are necessarily connected in virtue of a particular kind of relation that holds between the perceptions or representations of those events in an observer's mind. However, I'll argue that this is a paradox in the sense of being difficult to believe and contrary to received opinion, rather than in the sense of being logically unacceptable. Hume acknowledges that it's extremely hard to believe that causal necessity is mind-dependent in the way he thinks it is, but nevertheless takes himself to have established that this is in fact the case. So the paper is going to have 4 parts. In the first part, I'll argue that Hume holds that causal necessity is mind-dependent because he takes a necessary connection between two events to hold in virtue of the way those events are represented in an observer's mind. More specifically, in virtue of the mind's making a certain kind of transition from the perception of one event to the perception of another when one makes a causal inference. Hume expresses this view by claiming that causal necessity is, quote, the transition arising from the accustomed union of events. I'll present a case that the central argument of Treatise Section 1.3.14 relies on this identification. In the second part of the paper, I'm going to acknowledge that Hume's identifying causal necessity with a transition between perceptions seems at first glance untenable. In fact, one finds a number of different identity claims in this section of the treatise. Hume seems to identify causal necessity with an impression with a determination of the mind, and the same impression with a transition between perceptions. So these claims look like they're mutually inconsistent and individually untenable. So there seems to be pretty good reason to not to take Hume literally when he makes some or perhaps all of these claims. Nevertheless, I'm going to argue in section 3 that this interpretive move has a significant cost, and I'll propose a way of making sense of Hume's apparently confused identity claims. Then in the last part of the paper, I'll assess Hume's claim that his view involves a violent paradox in light of the account I've sketched. All right, so the first part. So I'm going to go over the sort of central argument of the section of the treatise that I'm going to be concerned with. So Hume begins Treatise Section 1.3.14 by asking, quote, what is our idea of necessity when we say that two objects are necessarily connected together? So Hume's concern in the chapter is first and foremost a question about meaning. He wants to know what we mean when we say that two objects are necessarily connected, and he thinks we can answer this question only if we first examine what our idea of necessity is. Earlier in the treatise, Hume claims that our ordinary concept of cause includes the idea of necessary connection. However, he thinks that we don't perceive that causes and effects are necessarily connected upon first observing them. So Hume's overall aim in the section is to find an impression from which he thinks our idea of necessary connection is copied. Finding such an impression, Hume thinks, will help clarify the content of the idea. The mind's perceptions, according to Hume, divide into impressions and ideas, where impressions are the livelier or more forceful perceptions we have through sensation and reflection on our own minds, and ideas are the less lively and less forceful perceptions we have when we remember, believe, or merely imagine things. Hume's copy principle, which he establishes in the very first section of the treatise, holds that every simple idea is copied from a simple impression, and that every complex idea is composed of simple ideas. The copy principle thus captures Hume's semantic empiricism. The limits of what we can meaningfully think about are a function of the simple impressions we've had through experience. If our thoughts and utterances about causal necessity are meaningful at all, there has to be some impression from which the idea is copied, or impressions if the idea turns out to be complex. So one of Hume's aims in this section is to show that our thoughts about causal necessity are indeed meaningful, and not just confused gibberish. Yet Hume also thinks that identifying the impression that's the source of our idea of necessary connection helps to clarify what the content of our idea of necessary connection is. So the shape of Hume's argument in this section of the treatise is far from perspicuous. So for one thing, I think Hume changes directions several times. At least twice, he seems to start the argument over completely and thereby calls into questions the conclusions he seems just to have reached. So my strategy is going to be to try to identify what I take the central argument of the section to be, and then to show how I think it builds on claims he establishes earlier in the work. So Hume answers the question what our idea of necessary connection is no fewer than 3 times in Treatise 1 through 14. And twice he answers the question only to suggest that the answer leaves something to be desired, either that it's too quick in the case of the first attempt, or that it's just wrong in the case of the second attempt. So he then starts from the beginning twice, reconsidering the question of the nature and origin of our idea of causal necessity. So it's not until paragraphs 15 to 23, if you don't have the paragraph numbers memorized, that's okay, but it's in those paragraphs that I think Hume finally provides the core of his account. So in paragraph 19, Hume purports to establish what I'm going to call the negative semantic conclusion, namely that our ideas of necessity, power, and efficacy do not represent, quote, anything that does or can belong to the objects which are constantly conjoined. Then in paragraph 22, he establishes what I'm going to call the positive semantic conclusion, which has a disjunctive form. He says, either we have no idea of necessity, or necessity is nothing but that determination of the thought to pass from causes to effects and from effects to causes according to their experienced union. So after developing his account of causal necessity, Hume declares that this account is the most violent paradox of the book and worries that, quote, with the generality of readers, the bias of the mind will prevail and give them a prejudice against the present doctrine. He then explains why we're prejudiced against the doctrine, and his explanation appeals to the mind's, quote, great propensity to spread itself on external objects. Then the remainder of the section contains Hume's two famous or perhaps infamous definitions of cause, and then he draws 4 corollaries of the account. So with this in mind, I'm going to try to focus my attention on the central arguments of the section, and that's what I'm going to do in the next section of the paper. So in the part of the section that constitutes Hume's central argument, Hume offers a genetic account of the origin of our idea of necessary connection. So the basic story is pretty familiar. Hume thinks that if there's a simple idea of necessary connection, there has to be some impression or experience of connectedness from which the idea is derived. However, Hume thinks that whenever we examine an event of some kind, which we haven't witnessed before, we don't experience the event as connected with any other. We don't expect any particular effect, and we don't believe that the event is necessarily connected with any other event of any particular kind. We only do these things after we've repeatedly experienced events of the same kind, closely followed by and spatially contiguous with events of some other kind. So I'm going to call that whole kind of experience repeated experience for short. I don't have to say the whole thing. Hume concludes that there's no impression of sensation of necessary connection. It follows that our idea of necessary connection must have its source in an impression of reflection. Hume then gives a psychological explanation of how we come to have the idea. He claims that repeated experience of events of one kind, which I'm going to call C's for causes, followed by events of another kind, E's for effects, leads to the formation of a habitual or customary association between perceptions of C's and perceptions of E's. The habitual association has two effects. First, one comes to expect an E whenever one perceives a C. Second, forming such an expectation somehow involves having a new impression. The idea of necessary connection is copied from this new impression. The trouble is that on the face of it, this account tells us the conditions under which we get the impression, but not what the impression's content is. Merely identifying the circumstances under which we get a perception doesn't tell us anything about what the perception's content is. But then it's hard to see how such an account could help clarify the content of our thoughts about causal necessity. Even worse, it's hard to see why the genetic account would entitle Hume to any conclusion about what our idea of necessary connection can or cannot represent. Yet Hume does think that the genetic account entitles him to just such a conclusion. The genetic account is somehow supposed to establish both the negative and positive semantic conclusions. So I'm going to begin by considering how Hume purports to establish the negative semantic conclusion, and then I'll turn to the positive one. How can the genetic explanation justify the negative semantic conclusion that our idea of necessary connection doesn't represent anything that does or even could belong to causes or effects? So I think there are some apparently easy answers that don't work out. First, it might just seem that Hume's point is simply that the idea is of an impression, and impressions clearly can't be qualities of objects, including causes. But Hume is only committed to the claim that the idea is copied from an impression. Now, if this claim implies that the idea is of or represents an impression, in the sense that it has an impression as its intentional object, then it equally entails that every simple idea has an impression as its intentional object. But I think it would be unsatisfying to think that Hume is claiming that the idea of necessary connection is of something that can't be a feature of causes for reasons that would make every simple idea of something that can't be a feature of causes. Second, we might think that Hume's point is that the idea, we might think that Hume's point is that the idea is of an impression or reflection, or the idea of a feeling, and such impressions can't be features of causes or effects. I think this also doesn't work. If central cases of impressions of reflections are the passions, like feelings of pride and love, we do think that ideas of those impressions represent features of many objects. For example, we think our parents and children and pets feel love just like we do. Hume's point isn't simply that the idea of necessary connection is of something that can't be a feature of inanimate causes, but of all the objects we treat as causes, including sentient beings like other people and animals. Third, we might think that Hume's point is that the idea of necessary connection is the idea of something that's internal to our minds, and so of something that can't be a feature of objects other than our own minds. But this too is inadequate. At best, I think this can explain why the idea of something that could not be a feature of objects other than our own minds. But it can't explain why Hume thinks that our idea of necessary connection does not represent anything that could be a feature of any causes, even when those causes are events in our own minds. So I think all of these proposals fail for the same basic reason. If Hume were only entitled to conclude that our idea of necessary connection represents something that cannot be a feature of objects of certain kinds, for example, that it can't be a feature of things other than minds, then he ought to respond differently than he does to philosophical controversy about what kinds of things can be causes. He ought to conclude, for example, that only minds are genuine causes. However, Hume doesn't conclude that only things that can have the feature represented by our idea of necessary connection are causes. Instead, he holds that anything is potentially a cause. It's not just material objects or mental objects or God that can be a cause. Anything we can have a perception of can be a cause. And yet he concludes that our idea of necessary connection doesn't represent anything that could be a feature of any causes. But then how can there be an idea that's of something that can't be a feature of any cause? This looks like a hard problem. It starts to look as if Hume is committed to thinking that there's an idea of something that couldn't be a feature of any object at all. Fortunately, I don't think that Hume is committed to this. Rather, he thinks that the genetic account shows that causal necessity can't be a feature of causes and effects because causal necessity itself and not just our impression of necessity, arises in the mind with the right kind of experience. And we'll see that Hume thinks it follows from this that the idea of causal necessity represents something that can't be a feature of causes and effects. So the genetic account purports to show this by establishing 3 important claims. So these are on your handout. The first one is that we never experience events as connected upon first witnessing an event of a particular kind followed by its effect, nor do we expect a particular effect to occur or believe that the first event is necessarily connected with another event of a particular kind. We do these things after repeated experience. Repeated experience does not produce or discover anything new in the events we take to be necessarily connected. So that's the second claim. The third claim is that repeated experience of conjoined events has an effect on us. It changes us in a way that's responsible for our coming to expect an event of the second kind upon witnessing an event of the first, for our experiencing the events as connected, and for our coming to believe that there's a necessary connection between the kinds of events. This change is the acquisition of a custom or habit of inferring that the effect will occur upon witnessing the cause. Okay, so we have almost all the pieces in place to see why Hume thinks he's entitled to the negative semantic conclusion. If the idea of necessary connection is the idea of or represents whatever it is that repeated experience produces or discovers, then we can explain why Hume concludes that the idea of necessary connection doesn't represent something that could be a feature of causes. Hume argues explicitly that repeated experience neither discovers nor produces anything new in the objects or events that are constantly conjoined. So why Hume thinks that repeated experience doesn't produce anything new in the conjoined events seems pretty clear. It would be pretty odd to think that repeated experience of conjoined events somehow causally influences those events so that they have some new feature. Why Hume thinks that repeated experience couldn't discover some new feature in the conjoined events, I think, is harder to grasp. Why couldn't repeated experience discover or provide evidence for some new feature of the conjoined events, namely that they're necessarily connected? So I'm going to return to this part of the argument in a little bit. But for now, I just want to assume that Hume can show that repeated experience doesn't discover anything new in the conjoined events. If the idea of necessary connection is the idea of whatever it is that repeated experience produces or discovers, and repeated experience can't produce or discover any feature of the conjoined objects or events, then the idea of necessary connection does not represent anything that could be a feature of those objects or events. So I submit that Hume thinks that the negative semantic conclusion is established because he assumes that our idea of necessary connection is the idea of whatever it is that repeated experience produces or discovers. This, of course, entails that a necessary connection just is whatever it is that repeated experience produces or discovers. But then our question is, well, what would justify this assumption? Right? We might think that Hume is entitled to claim that the impression that gives rise to our idea of necessary connection is whatever it is that repeated experience produces or discovers, but not that causal necessity itself is whatever it is that repeated experience of a constant conjunction produces or discovers. But if Hume merely held that the impression that gives rise to the idea is produced or discovered by repeated experience, then I think he wouldn't be entitled to the negative semantic conclusion. He would only describe the circumstances under which we get the impression that gives rise to our idea of necessary connection. But then he wouldn't be entitled to conclude anything, I think, about the content of the idea. So there's textual evidence that Hume holds that causal necessity just is whatever is produced or discovered by repeated experience. Indeed, he claims, quote, wherever we find anything new to be discovered or produced by the repetition of events or resembling events, there we must place the power and must never look for it in any other object. So the phrase, there we must place the power, is maybe a little bit looser than one might wish to establish my interpretation, but I think if I'm right, Hume is claiming that power or causal necessity just is the thing that's discovered or produced by the repetition. Hume then concludes that repeated experience produces something new in the observer. So in theory, there should be sort of 4 possibilities, right? Repeated experience could discover something new in the objects, it could produce something new in the objects, it could produce something new in us, or it could discover something new in us. That 4th possibility, that somehow repeated experience could discover something new in us, Hume doesn't seem to think is even a live option. So that's the only possibility that he doesn't sort of say anything about. I think it just doesn't seem like a possibility even worth arguing against. So Hume describes the effect of repeated experience as, quote, a determination of the mind to pass from one object to its usual attendant and to conceive it in a stronger light upon account of that relation. But then Hume also describes the effect of repeated experience as a kind of impression. So he claims, quote, this determination is the only effect of the resemblance. The resemblance here is repetition of resembling events. And therefore must be the same with power or efficacy, whose idea is derived from the resemblance. So here Hume assumes that power or efficacy is produced by the resemblance. And since the resemblance doesn't produce or discover anything new in the conjoined objects, he concludes that the determination of the mind just is power, efficacy, or in general, causal necessity. Later in the same paragraph, Hume repeats, necessity, then, is the effect of this observation, the observation of a constant conjunction, and is nothing but an internal impression of the mind or a determination to carry our thoughts from one object to another. Finally, he reaches what I've called the positive semantic conclusion. He says, either we have no idea of necessity, or necessity is nothing but that determination of the thought to pass from causes to effects and from effects to causes according to their experienced union. So Hume is led in this way to make 3 claims, and these claims look like they're individually untenable and mutually inconsistent. So he claims, and this is the 3 on the handout, there's a 4th one, but we'll get to that later. So the first claim is that causal necessity is, quote, a determination of the mind to pass from one object to its usual attendant and to conceive it in a stronger light upon account of that relation. Second, he claims the determination of the mind to pass from one object to its usual attendant is an impression. And third, he claims causal necessity is an impression. So this looks like quite a muddle. How could necessity be an impression? How could a determination of the mind or of the thought to pass from one object to its usual attendant be an impression? These claims both look like category mistakes. So in the next section, I'm going to try to sort through this muddle, and I'm going to try to show that it isn't really a muddle at all. But first, I think we're in a position to appreciate the philosophical work that these 3 claims are doing and the potential cost of trying to interpret Hume in a way that gives them up. So it's Hume's assumption that causal necessity is whatever is produced or discovered by repeated experience that leads him to accept 1. The thought that our idea of necessary connection has to have its source in an impression puts pressure on him to accept 2. And of course, 1 and 2 entail 3 by the transitivity of identity. But if Hume didn't assume that causal necessity is whatever is produced or discovered by repeated experience, he couldn't draw the negative semantic conclusion that the idea of causal necessity doesn't represent anything that could be a feature of causes or effects. Before returning to the apparently confused identity claims in the next section, I want to conclude this section by considering why Hume makes the assumption that causal necessity just is whatever is produced or discovered by repeated experience. So I'm going to call that the assumption. So my proposal is that Hume makes the assumption because his search for an impression from which the idea of necessary connection is copied is driven by a conception of what the discovery of a necessary connection allows us to do. It enables us to infer that the second event will occur whenever we witness the first. So Hume's search for an impression of necessary connection is guided by a conception of the kind of cognitive achievement, the kind of cognitive achievement that the discovery of such connections makes possible. Okay? The important cognitive achievement, Hume holds, is our ability to make inferences about things we don't immediately observe. So I'm going to call this Hume's guiding thought. In Treatise 1.3.14, Hume expresses this guiding thought by claiming, quote, that the necessary connection betwixt causes and effects is the foundation of our inference from one to the other. So that was on your handout. So when Hume claims that necessary connections are the foundation of causal inferences, it's unclear whether he's making a claim about the justification of those inferences or maybe just a claim about the psychological mechanisms that are responsible for our making such inferences. This is, of course, bound up with very difficult questions about Hume's epistemology, questions that I certainly don't intend to settle today, and I would prefer not to even take a stand on them. So I think, though, that we can make some progress on what Hume means, on what it means for a necessary connection to be the foundation of an inference while still remaining neutral on the controversial questions about Hume's epistemology, including whether inferences to the unobserved are ever justified or not. So I propose that we take Hume's claim that necessary connections are the foundation of our inferences to mean that a necessary connection is the kind of thing that at least seems to give us reason to make certain inferences. So something can seem to give us reason to make certain inferences, even if it turns out that in the end it doesn't. So Hume's guiding thought in searching for an impression of necessary connection is that necessary connections are the foundation of our inferences about the unobserved, in that the existence of a necessary connection between events of two kinds at least seems to give us reason to make inferences from the existence of an event of one kind to the existence of an event of the other kind. Now, if this is right, I think we can explain why Hume makes the assumption. So he purports to have shown that it's repeatedly experiencing events of one kind followed by events of another kind that leads us to make causal inferences. If a necessary connection between a cause and effect is the foundation of our inference from one to the other, then it seems that the necessary connection must somehow or other be closely related to the repeated experience that leads us to make such inferences. Repeated experience is somehow closely related with something that at least seems to give us reason to make such inferences. Hume thinks that there are only three live options. Repeated experience could discover some feature of causes and effects that seems to give us reason to make such inferences. Repeated experience could produce some new feature of causes and effects that seems to give us reason to make such inferences. Or repeated experience could produce something new in us that seems to give us reason to make such inferences by changing how we represent or experience those events. This account also helps us better appreciate Hume's argument for the claim that experiencing repetition doesn't discover any new feature of the repeated objects or events. So I set aside consideration of this argument above. Why not think that there's some feature of objects that repetition reveals to us or provides evidence for? Hume's argument for this is brief and I think somewhat cryptic. He claims that the possibility that repetition discovers something new in the objects has been ruled out in Treatise 1.3.6 because, he says, we can draw no inference from such a discovery, nor make it a subject either of our demonstrative or probable reasonings. So if Hume is assuming that necessary connections between causes and effects play some role in explaining how we make inferences about the unobserved, then I think his quick dismissal makes perfect sense. If repeated experience did discover something in the objects, whatever it was, it wouldn't help account for how we make inferences, and so it's just not the kind of thing that Hume is looking for. Okay, so part 3. Hume is apparently committed to the identity claims 1 through 3 on your handout, which hold that causal necessity is both a determination of the mind and an impression. So I want to begin by considering the second claim, that the determination of the mind to pass from one object to its usual attendant is an impression. So this claim looks like it involves a category mistake. How can an impression be a determination of the mind to pass from one perception to another? It's tempting to conclude that Hume's just getting carried away when he makes such claims, and there appears to be an obvious fallback position. Hume might hold that the impression is of or represents a determination of the mind, even though he can't hold that the impression is a determination of the mind. But this seems to raise another problem, since determination seems to be a causal term, and to claim that we have an impression of a determination of the mind seems to suggest that we have an impression of genuine mental efficacy, or maybe not of efficacy, but of patiency, right, of being determined, even though we can have no impression of efficacy or patiency outside of the mind. This might seem to imply that we have some sort of special access to or experience of causal powers in our own mind, a kind of access that we don't have to external causal power. But Hume denies that there's any fundamental asymmetry between mental and non-mental causation. So Barry Stroud, for example, attempts to avoid these problems by claiming that the impression that's the source of idea-necessary connection is neither identical with nor represents a determination of the mind. Instead, Stroud claims that the best way to make sense of Hume's confused identity claims is to take him to mean merely that there's a simple impression of reflection, some distinct feeling that occurs whenever the mind is determined to form a belief about the unobserved. So on this view, the feeling just accompanies the determination of the mind, or accompanies a causal inference, but isn't identical with the determination of the mind. But if the impression is just a feeling that we happen to get when we make causal inferences, and the idea of this feeling just is the idea of necessary connection, then Hume isn't entitled to the negative semantic conclusion that the idea of necessary connection doesn't represent anything that could be a feature of causes or effects. So I think that this approach undermines Hume's reasons for thinking that the idea of necessary connection is of something that couldn't be a feature of causes or effects. So I propose, therefore, to see if we can find a way of taking Hume at his word when he asserts 1 through 3. So I want to turn again to paragraph 21, which is on the handout and which I've already talked about. So this occurs immediately after the first 3 identity claims. Hume writes, "The necessary connection betwixt causes and effects is the foundation of our inference from one to the other." So I've already made a big deal about that. The next sentence is, "The foundation of our inference is the transition arising from the accustomed union. These are therefore the same." So I propose that Hume's view is that a necessary connection just is, quote, "a transition arising from the accustomed union," and that the impression of necessary connection is the experience of making this kind of transition. So at first glance, Hume's identifying a necessary connection with a customary transition seems not to help us understand how we can hold the 3 confused identity claims. Indeed, it looks like it just makes matters worse, because now I have to add a 4th claim to my list. So this is on the handout. Claim 4 is that causal necessity is a customary transition between perceptions. So now the question is, can Hume really hold that causal necessity is an impression and a determination of the mind and a customary transition between perceptions? How could he hold all of those things? So I want to start with the 4th claim. Hume claims that a necessary connection is a particular kind of transition between perceptions, namely a kind of transition that arises from repeated experience. Hume also holds that such transitions are felt. The transition from one perception to another when one makes a causal inference has a particular kind of felt character or phenomenology. Hume holds that experience of repeated events produces something new in us, and this is the source of our idea of necessary connection. What's produced by such repetition is a new habit, specifically a habitual transition from perceptions of events of one kind to perceptions of events of another kind. In other words, it's a habitual transition. The impression of necessary connection, then, is just the experience of making such a habitual transition. So 2 problems have to be tackled. First, how can the impression that gives rise to our idea of necessity be identified with the customary transition itself? Second, how can a transition between perceptions be experienced or felt at all? So I want to start with the second question. If a transition between perceptions is experienced or felt, is this experience a third perception, right? Fortunately, I think there's a common sense of understanding what it means for a transition to be felt or experienced. It's simply the way that one perception gives way to another. There's no third thing that somehow has to be experienced. If the experience transition between the perception of an A and the perception of a B is just the first perception kind of giving way to the second, then it isn't mysterious or problematic to claim that a transition is felt or experienced. A slightly different way of putting the point is just to say that what the experience of the transition between perceptions is nothing over and above having the associated perceptions one after the other. This, I think, allows us to answer the first question as well. How can the customary transition be an impression? The customary transition is something we experience, and the impression of necessary connection just is this experience. But the impression needn't be anything distinct from the customary transition between perceptions. The impression is, in a way, just the whole package, the perception of one event followed by the perception of another, where the way in which one perception follows another is marked by a particular kind of feeling or phenomenal character. In short, there's something it's like for one to make a customary transition between perceptions, something that distinguishes customary transitions from just other perceptions following each other. So turn now to claim 1, that causal necessity is a determination of the mind, and claim 2, that this determination of the mind is an impression. Okay, so now we have another problem. If causal necessity is a particular kind of transition between perceptions, then can it also be a determination of the mind to make such a transition? In short, the view seems to entail that the determination of the mind to pass from one perception to another is the transition between associated perceptions. But this seems like it might not be right. One might hold that the determination of the mind is the mind's being caused to make a transition, but then the cause of the transition has to be distinct from the transition itself. Right? So it looks like Hume is saying the cause is identical with the effect, and that would be bad. Okay, so how can Hume claim that a necessary connection is both a customary transition and the cause of that transition? Okay, so I want to try to solve this problem by reconsidering what Hume might mean by claiming that the necessary connection is the determination of the mind to pass from one object to its usual attendant. So I think we should resist thinking that the phrase, the determination of the mind to pass from one idea to its usual attendant, is merely synonymous with the mind's being caused to pass from one idea to its usual attendant. The mind's being determined to pass from one idea to its usual attendant is the mind's settling on something in particular from a range of options. A determination of the mind or thought can be understood as making the thought determinate, that is, arriving at a determinate thought. There are many perceptions that one could have on an occasion. A determination of the mind or thought is settling on one determinate perception from the range of possibilities. The mind is determined when it's fixed on a particular end, in this case, the formation of a particular belief. Now, this isn't to deny that the determination of the mind is something caused, since, after all, Hume thinks that everything has a cause. But rather, it's to point out that the determination of the mind need not and should not be read as simply synonymous with the mind's being caused. So if we take determination in something like this sense, then there's no problem in claiming that the customary transition is what determines the mind to pass from one perception to its usual attendant. It is the customary transition that determines the thought, that is, that settles or makes determinate what idea we have on a particular occasion. Okay, last part of the paper. So I want to return to the paradox. If Hume holds that the idea of necessary connection just is the idea of the determination of the mind to pass from the perception of a cause to the idea of its effect, then he holds that causal necessity is mind-dependent. Yet if it's true that causal necessity is mind-dependent, why should it strike us as such a violent paradox? Hume has to explain why we have such a hard time accepting his conclusion, why we're so strongly inclined to believe that causes operate entirely independent of the mind. So Hume addresses this problem explicitly. He worries, quote, that with the generality of readers, the bias of the mind will prevail and give them a prejudice against the present doctrine. He then goes on to explain, and this is the long quote on your handout, this contrary bias is easily accounted for. 'Tis a common observation that the mind has a great propensity to spread itself on external objects and to conjoin with them any internal impressions which they occasion, and which always make their appearance at the same time that these objects discover themselves to the senses. I'm going to skip a little bit. The same propensity is the reason why we suppose necessity and power to lie in the objects we consider, not in our mind that considers them. Notwithstanding, it is not possible for us to form the most distant idea of that quality when it is not taken for the determination of the mind to pass from the idea of an object to that of its usual attendant. This is the notorious spreading the mind passage, and it's sometimes thought to hold the key to understanding Hume's view about causal necessity. But it's worth emphasizing that Hume's primary aim in this passage is to explain why he thinks readers will have a hard time believing his conclusions about the nature of causal necessity. He's already developed an account of causal necessity and offered his key arguments for this account. This passage, if I'm right, serves mainly to tie up an important loose end, which is to explain why his conclusion seems so hard to believe, indeed why it's the most violent paradox in the book. Hume does this by appealing to the mind's general propensity to spread itself on objects. It's because this inclination is so strong that Hume's conclusion strikes us as being such a violent paradox. The claim that the impression of necessary connection is the experienced transition between associated perceptions provides a way of understanding what it is to spread the mind onto objects. We attempt to project or spread the experienced transition between perceptions onto the objects represented by those perceptions. So we ordinarily conflate a feature of the transition between the perception of the cause and the perception of the effect with features of the causes and effects themselves. We run together features of our representation of the cause with features of the cause. And it's our tendency to do this that explains why we're so reluctant to accept Hume's view, even once we come to see that repeated experience of conjoined events must either produce or discover necessary connections, and that repeated experience doesn't produce or discover anything new in the causes or effects themselves. Our mistake, according to this interpretation, is not in taking there to be necessary connections at all. Our mistake, rather, is in our taking a relation that holds between causes and effects in virtue of features of our perceptions of those events to be a relation that holds in virtue of objective features of the events themselves. And it's the resilience of our tendency to make this mistake that explains, Hume thinks, why his account of causal necessity seems so paradoxical. So according to the interpretation I've defended, Hume holds that necessary connections between causes and effects just are a kind of experienced transition between the perceptions of those causes and effects in the mind of the person who observes them. Causation, insofar it depends on features of the conjoined objects or events, is nothing more than constant conjunction. But that's not all there is to causation. There's also the experienced transition between associated perceptions. This view seems to make necessary connections not only mind-dependent, but even radically subjective. A necessary connection between two events is a kind of felt transition between the perceptions of those events in the mind of an observer. Hume may well appreciate that this is part of what makes the paradox so violent. Of course, I don't want to deny that this view faces substantial philosophical challenges. But I want to conclude by taking stock of the commitments that seem to lead Hume to this view. For philosophers broadly sympathetic with empiricism, I think Hume's argument is worth closer consideration, since it seems to rely primarily on very general empiricist commitments, and at least not obviously on an excessively narrow conception of the contents of experience or on particular details of Hume's theory of ideas. So the first such commitment is Hume's semantic empiricism, in the form of his commitment to the copy principle, that the content of all of our thoughts is a function of the content of ideas copied from impressions of sense or reflection. The second commitment is his guiding thought that causal necessity grounds our practice of making inductive inferences. The view that causation plays an important role in explaining some of our basic cognitive achievements, and that an adequate analysis of causation should help explain these cognitive achievements, is, I think, a view that should be attractive to empiricists. If I'm right, Hume's account of causal necessity arises from these two commitments in a way that makes it hard to see how he could give it up without seriously compromising his empiricism. Thank you.